At 12 o'clock at night, an old friend I hadn't heard from in a long time called me. "Promise me something. No matter who shows up, don't open the door," he said, his voice trembling with fear. Before I could ask why, the line suddenly went dead. Then the pounding began. The noise continued for several minutes before it suddenly stopped. I slowly walked to the door and looked through the peephole. What I saw outside made my legs give out beneath me. Welcome, everyone. Before we continue the story, take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. I love reading your messages. A quick note. This is a fictional story created to bring meaningful and valuable storytelling. Now let's return to that moment at midnight when the pounding on the door began. The landline rang at 2:03 a.m. A shrill, antique scream that tore through the artificial fog of my lorazepam-soaked brain. I, Warren Kendrick, a 72-year-old, who once spent my days untangling million-dollar embezzlement schemes as a forensic private investigator, now found myself struggling to even focus on the blurred numbers of my own alarm clock. The blue glow of the digital display stung my eyes, the digits swimming like minnows in a dark pond. I reached for the handset, my fingers fumbling with a tremor that had become my constant, unwelcome companion since June. In my former life, I used to find a needle in a haystack of offshore accounts, but now I can barely find my own car keys. I had spent 6 weeks blaming the slow decay of my cognitive faculties on the simple cruelty of age. My son Thane would always offer a sympathetic smile when I forgot a name or stumbled over a sentence, telling me it was just the natural course of things. "It is just age, Dad," he would say. "Everyone slows down at 72. But as I pressed the cold plastic of the phone to my ear, a primal instinct sharpened by decades of hunting human predators flickered to life in the back of my mind. You think you know your own body until it starts lying to you? Or until someone else starts rewriting its code. I had been decoding financial crimes for 40 years, and suddenly the mathematics of my own physical decline stopped adding up. The exhaustion wasn't a weary slide into sleep. It was a heavy chemical curtain being drawn across my consciousness every night after my evening coffee. The voice on the other end belonged to Garrison Price, my former partner. From a forensic life I had tried to bury 15 years ago. Now an Asheville police captain, whose tone held the jagged edge of a man who had seen the abyss. "Warren!" He barked, his voice frantic, a sharp contrast to the professional distance he had maintained since our partnership dissolved in 2010. "Warren, it is Garrison. Do not speak, just listen." I have only seconds before they realize this line is active. My heart hammered against my ribs, a rhythmic war drum that felt too large for my chest. I opened my mouth to ask him why he was calling at this ungodly hour, but he cut me off with a desperate snarl. "Listen to me, you are in danger. Do not open the door. For the love of God, no matter who it is or what you think you see, do not open that door. The person in that house with you, she isn't who you think." Garrison, that I managed to whisper, my voice thick with the remnants of the sedative. "What are you talking about?" Aria is silence. Then the click. The line wasn't dropped. It was cut. The static hiss that followed was as cold as a mountain winter, a dead frequency that signaled the end of my safety. I sat there in the darkness, the phone still pressed to my ear, paralyzed by the weight of a warning that had come 15 years too late. I looked at the bedroom door, the shadows of the Blue Ridge Mountains stretching across the floor, like long, dark fingers reaching for my bed. Then the silence was shattered. Heavy, deliberate knocks began to fall against my front door 2 floors below. These weren't the frantic taps of a neighbor in need or the polite rapping of a visitor. These were strong, rhythmic strikes that seemed to shake the very foundations of the Kendrick estate. Each thud vibrated through the floorboards, traveling up the legs of my bed and into my leaden limbs. The pounding wasn't a request for entry. It was the sound of a hammer driving nails into a coffin I wasn't ready to lie down in. I forced myself to swing my legs over the side of the bed. My limbs felt like they were filled with wet concrete, a side effect of the slow dosing protocol I was only now beginning to recognize as a weapon. I had been a fool. I had been a mathematical certainty in someone else's ledger, a variable to be removed. I gripped the mahogany banister, my knuckles white, as I began the agonizing descent toward the foyer. The house felt different tonight. The air was cloyingly sweet, thick with the scent of Arya's calming lavender candles that she insisted on lighting every evening. To anyone else, it was the smell of a peaceful home. To me, it was now the scent of a funeral parlor. "Who is there?" I called out, trying to summon the booming authority I had once used to stare down corrupt CEOs. My voice came out as a fragile rasp, barely carrying past the landing. The knocking continued steady as a heartbeat, never pausing for my inquiry. I looked toward the stairs leading to the third floor. "Thane!" I shouted. "Thane, are you awake? Nothing!" My son was usually a light sleeper, but the upper reaches of the house remained deathly quiet. I reached the first floor, my bare feet silent on the cold hardwood. The front door was a massive slab of reinforced oak, a barrier I had always considered impregnable. Now it felt like paper. I crept toward the entryway, my hand trembling as I reached for the brass handle of the deadbolt. The pounding stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving an absolute suffocating silence in its wake. In that void, I heard a sound that chilled me more than the warning. It was a faint metallic click from the porch, the specific sound of a deadbolt being turned by a key from the outside, followed by the heavy thud of a secondary lock engaging. I reached the landing, my hand trembling on the banister as the knocking vanished into an absolute, suffocating silence, leaving only the heavy scent of Arya's calming lavender candles to fill the void. I stood rooted to the landing, my fingers digging into the polished mahogany of the banister until my knuckles throbbed. The silence that followed the double click of the front door was more violent than the pounding had been. It was a suffocating atmospheric pressure that made the air feel thick with the cloyingly sweet chemical undertone of Arya's lavender candles. I forced my leaden legs to carry me the final few steps toward the foyer. Each movement a victory of will over the benzodiazepines coursing through my veins. I pressed my eye to the cool brass of the peephole, expecting to see an empty porch, or perhaps a fleeing figure, but what stared back at me was a nightmare wrapped in my son's skin. My son, Thane Kendrick, a 42-year-old architect, who used to build structures that defied gravity, now looked as though he were collapsing under the weight of his own skin. His face was inches from the glass, distorted by the fisheye lens into a grotesque caricature. But it was his eyes that stopped my heart. They were vacant, the pupils blown wide and glassy, reflecting the porch light, like the eyes of a taxidermied animal. A strange, hollow smile was fixed on his face, a rictus of joy that didn't reach his deadened gaze. He wasn't blinking. He was just waiting like a prop placed there for my benefit. "Thane." I whispered the name, catching in my throat. "My son, what have they done to you?" As I stared, paralyzed by a mix of paternal grief and primal shock, the view through the peephole widened. The mountain mist drifted across the porch, and from the swirling gray shadows, 3 tall figures emerged. They wore long, heavy robes of a black so deep it seemed to absorb the dim light, their faces hidden behind pointed hoods. They stood in a perfect semicircle behind Thane, motionless as stone sentinels. I realized with a jolt of cosmic dread that they weren't just men. They were shadows with weight and oppressive presence that seemed to drain the warmth from the house. How do you explain to a 911 dispatcher that your son's soul has been replaced by a hollow shell? My gaze dropped to Thane's hand, and my blood turned to ice. He was holding a key, the brass spare to the front door that I'd reported missing months ago. I had assumed I'd misplaced it in my growing forgetfulness, but seeing it in his trembling fingers was a definitive proof of a long-term infiltration. The security of my home hadn't been breached by force. It had been dismantled from the inside piece by piece while I slept. I stumbled back from the door, my balance failing, as my legs began to feel like they were made of cooling wax melting under the heat of my own terror. I fumbled for my cell phone in my robe pocket, my movements clumsy and uncoordinated. I managed to dial those 3 digits, the screen's brightness stinging my eyes like a physical blow. 911, what is your emergency? The dispatcher's voice was calm, a stark contrast to the storm in my foyer. They're outside. I wheezed, my voice barely audible. My son, he's out there, but he's not right. There are men in robes. Please, for the love of God, hurry. Sir, I need you to stay on the line, the voice said, but I could barely focus. Behind me, the kitchen remained dark, a cavern of shadows that felt suddenly predatory. The handle turned. The bolt slid. The fortress was gone. I watched in slow-motion horror as the heavy brass handle of the front door began to rotate. I had heard the lock engage from the outside just moments ago, but now it was being retracted. My heart hammered a frantic rhythm against my ribs, a desperate warning that I was trapped between the monsters on the porch and a threat I hadn't yet named inside my own walls. I realized then that the circle didn't leave because they were finished. They left because Arya was already inside, and she was the one opening the door. My legs finally gave out, and I slid down the wall, the cold hardwood biting into my skin. I felt a wave of nausea roll over me, the toxins in my blood reacting to the spike of adrenaline. I was a 72-year-old man who had spent his life hunting the truth, and now the truth was about to walk through my door and extinguish me. I stared at the widening crack of the entryway, the mountain air spilling in, smelling of damp earth and ancient rot. I tried to crawl away to find some weapon, some refuge, but I was spent. I was a variable that had been solved, a mark that had been played. The handle turned. The bolt slid. The fortress was gone. Just as the door swung inward with a sickening heavy groan, the darkness was suddenly obliterated. The hallway was bathed in a blinding, strobing explosion of blue and red light reflecting off the foyer glass and casting long, frantic shadows across the ceiling. A police cruiser had swung into the driveway, its tires spitting gravel, the siren letting out a final authoritative chirp. I looked up from my position on the floor, my vision blurring, and realized I wasn't alone in the hallway. A figure stood in the shadows near the kitchen entrance, watching the door with a stillness that matched the robed figures outside. The front door swung inward with a sickening groan, but before the shadows could cross the threshold, the house was suddenly bathed in the blinding, strobing blue and red light of a police cruiser, and I realized I wasn't alone in the hallway. A flash bang of adrenaline couldn't clear the fog as 2 officers burst into my foyer, their boots thumping on the hardwood with a rhythm that mocked my own failing heart. I remained on the floor, my back pressed against the wall, as the blinding beams of their flashlights cut the darkness of the hallway into frantic, jagged pieces. The front door swung inward with a sickening groan, inviting the mountain mist to spill across the threshold like a cold, gray shroud. They were right there. I wheezed, my voice cracking, as I pointed a trembling finger toward the open porch. My son. Thane. He was standing in the center, and those men in hoods. Officer Miller. A man whose face was etched with the weary skepticism of a decade on the force, stepped out onto the porch, his hand resting on his service weapon. Officer Vance followed his flashlight, sweeping across the damp mulch of the flower beds and the stone walkway. I watched through the doorway, my lungs burning, waiting for them to haul the robed figures out of the shadows. But there was only the sound of August crickets and the distant mournful hoot of an owl. Sir, the ground is undisturbed, Officer Miller said, stepping back inside and holstering his weapon. There is no one out here. No footprints in the mulch, no signs of a struggle. The porch is empty. The humiliation hit me harder than the physical weakness. I knew what I had seen, the glassy, vacant eyes of my son, the oppressive weight of the robed sentinels. It had been as real as the hardwood beneath my palms. But the heavy mist of Asheville had seemingly swallowed every trace of the circle, leaving me looking like a confused old man lost in a midnight delusion. How do you fight a shadow when even the light of a police flashlight refuses to reveal it? As I struggled to find the words to defend my sanity, a soft, familiar rustle came from the kitchen hallway. Aria Redmond, 36, stood by the stove with the poise of the hedge fund analyst she claimed to be her smile, as perfectly polished as the silver tray she used to serve my daily poison. She was draped in a silk robe, her hair artfully disheveled to suggest she had just been jolted from a deep sleep. She rushed toward me, her face a masterpiece of flawlessly rehearsed concern. "Oh, Warren," she cried gently, taking my hand and kneeling beside me. "Officers, I am so sorry. Dad hasn't been himself since the summer heat started. He's had these episodes lately, confusing dreams for reality." I looked at her, my skin crawling at the touch of her cool, manicured fingers. She whispered to the officers about my unfortunate cognitive decline, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. I reached for a rebuttal, but the benzodiazepines choose that moment to surge, making my tongue feel like a heavy, useless piece of felt. "Warren, honey, you're safe now," she cooed, her eyes locking onto mine. "It was just a dream. Go back to sleep." I caught it then, a split-second lapse in her performance. As she adjusted her robe, I noticed a single damp leaf from a mountain laurel stuck to the silk hem near her ankle. It was a forest leaf, wet with the same mist that was currently drifting through my front door. The officers didn't see it. They were too busy nodding sympathetically at the beautiful, caring daughter-in-law. Aria's kindness was a velvet glove, but I could feel the cold iron fingers of the circle tightening beneath the fabric. By the time the police left promising to keep a car in the neighborhood, I was back in bed, tucked in by the woman who was slowly erasing me. Morning arrived with the cruel clarity of high-altitude sunlight. I made my way to the breakfast nook, my joints aching with a rhythmic throb. Aria was already there, the picture of domestic perfection. "Drink up, Warren," she said, placing a steaming mug of my favorite dark roast in front of me. "You need to keep your strength up for Owen. He's been asking about his grandpa." I took a cautious sip, and the world suddenly narrowed to the tip of my tongue. There was a sharp, acrid, metallic taste, a copper tang that burned the back of my throat like a battery terminal. It wasn't just the coffee. As I pulled the mug away, I felt a familiar, warm saltiness in my mouth. I ran my tongue along my gum line and tasted blood. It was a specific, terrifying side effect I had read about in fraud cases involving heavy metal or chemical saturation. My own body was beginning to leak from the inside out. Trust your tongue, they say. But what do you do when the very thing meant to sustain you tastes like your own execution? Aria was watching me from the doorway, her hands folded neatly in front of her. For a brief, terrifying second, the mask slipped. The caring analyst vanished, replaced by a predator measuring the distance to its prey. "It tastes different today, Aria," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. She didn't blink. "It's a new blend, Warren. High in antioxidants. It's supposed to help with the fog." She smiled, a cold, clinical curve of the lips that didn't reach her eyes. I realized then that I wasn't just being drugged. I was being marinated. Every cup, every candle, every kind gesture was a calculated step toward the September full moon. As I stared into the black depths of the mug, the reflection of my own gaunt face seemed to warn me. If I finished this cup, I wouldn't live long enough to see the sunset. I didn't pour the coffee down the drain. That would leave traces for Aria to find in the plumbing, a residue of my survival that her hyper-vigilant eyes would surely catch. Instead, I maintained my mask of tremors and half-lidded exhaustion, carrying the steaming mug into my private study. My hands shook, but not from the poison. It was the adrenaline of a man who had finally identified the hunter in his own home. I locked the door behind me, a habit I'd resumed under the guise of wanting to nap, without being disturbed by my grandson Owen's energetic play. In the corner of the room sat a vibrant Boston fern, a gift from my late wife, that I had meticulously cared for over the years. "Forgive me, old friend," I whispered, my voice a dry rasp. "You're taking the bullet for me today." I poured the dark, acrid liquid into the soil, watching it disappear into the black earth. It wasn't just poison. It was a scorched earth policy in liquid form. I sat back in my leather armchair, a stopwatch in my hand, and began the biological autopsy of my morning meal. By noon, the first signs appeared. The lush green fronds began to curl at the edges, turning a sickly, translucent yellow. By 2 p.m., the deterioration accelerated, with a speed that was mathematically impossible for natural decay. The fern didn't just die. It surrendered its fronds, curling into charred black questions that pointed directly at the woman in the kitchen. By the time the afternoon shadows lengthened across my desk, the plant was a skeletal ruin, its life extinguished by a single dose of whatever Arya was stirring into my daily routine. The analytical horror of it settled into my bones. I had been ingesting this for weeks, my forgetfulness, a carefully manufactured symptom of a long-term liquidation. I realized then that the forgetfulness I experienced wasn't a side effect of the poison, but the intended goal. Arya needed me too, confused to notice the physical evidence she was leaving in plain sight. If I couldn't trust my own memory, how could I trust my suspicion that she was a wolf in my parlor? Fueled by the fern's death, I returned to my bedroom. I needed to know if the coffee was the only delivery system. I began to investigate my surroundings with the systematic precision of my PI days. I stripped the heavy quilt from my bed and ran my fingers along the top sheet. There was a strange, waxy residue, odorless, but leaving a tacky, synthetic film on my skin. I held my fingers to the light, seeing the faint, iridescent sheen. They haven't just been drugging my drink. They've been marinating me. Every breath I took in this room was a step closer to the grave. I moved toward the nightstand, where Arya kept a rotating supply of calming lavender candles. I scraped a sliver of the wax into a plastic sandwich bag I'd hidden in my robe. It didn't smell like flowers. Beneath the floral top note was the heavy, cloying scent of a chemical sedative, the kind used in industrial-strength sleep aids. How do you fight a war when the very air you breathe is the enemy's ammunition? I realized the scale of the infiltration was absolute. My bed, my air, my morning ritual. It was all a singular, coordinated effort to keep me in a state of chemical submission. I moved with a frantic, silent urgency, bagging a sample of the waxy sheet residue and hiding it behind the hollowed-out spine of an old law ledger on my bookshelf. I was building a case piece by piece against the woman who was currently humming a dissonant, rhythmic chant in the hallway. Footsteps, soft, rhythmic, approaching. I froze with the quilt half-tucked my heart, hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The silence of the study was gone, replaced by the impending intrusion of the predator. "Is everything okay in here?" Warren Arya's voice came through the door, sharp and sweet as a razor dipped in honey. "I thought I heard you moving furniture." I took a deep breath, forcing my muscles to go limp, forcing the PI to retreat back into the shell of the confused senior. "Just looking for my slippers, Arya," I called out, injecting a tremor of frustration into my tone. "My mind is a bit scattered today. I can't seem to remember where I left them this morning." I heard her pause on the other side of the wood. I could almost feel her measuring my words, calculating the level of my decline. "Don't strain yourself, honey," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sympathy. "I'll be in to tidy up in a moment. You just sit down and rest." I scrambled to finish remaking the bed, smoothing out the sheets to hide my investigation. As I tucked the final corner of the quilt under the mattress, my hand brushed against something hard and unnaturally smooth, taped to the underside of the mahogany headboard. I slid my fingers along the wood and felt the tiny circular protrusion of a high-tech microphone. The betrayal went deeper than blood or money. While remaking the bed, I found a small, high-tech microphone taped to the underside of the headboard, realizing that every realization I've muttered to himself may have been recorded. My skin went cold. Had I spoken aloud when I discovered the waxy residue? Had I whispered to the fern, I stared at the tiny black dot, a digital eye in the heart of my sanctuary, and realized that my performance had to be flawless from this moment on. I wasn't just a grandfather or a victim anymore. I was a counterintelligence agent in a house where the walls were listening. I froze with the quilt, half-tucked my eyes, locking onto the tiny black dot of the microphone, wondering if the heavy silence following Arya's question meant she already knew I was lying. Watching my own son pack a bag for a journey he clearly didn't want to take felt like witnessing a man preparing his own funeral shroud. I stood by the door of the mudroom, my shoulders slumped to maintain the illusion of a man defeated by his own biology. Arya stood right behind me, her presence a cold weight that I could feel even without turning around. She had entered the room moments after my discovery of the microphone, but instead of the confrontation, I feared she had offered a chillingly sweet explanation. "Oh, Warren, that little device is just a fall detection monitor I installed for your safety," she had said, her voice like silk over a blade. "I didn't want to worry you with the details." She was gaslighting my discovery into an act of love, and I had been forced to nod and thank her with a trembling hand. Now I watched Thane Kendrick, my 42-year-old son, stuffing a waterproof jacket into his duffel with hands that wouldn't stop shaking. "Thane, you've always hated the woods," I said, injecting a note of paternal concern into my voice. "You used to say the silence of the forest was too loud. Why this camping trip now?" He didn't look at me. He couldn't. His eyes darted to the corner of the room, anywhere but my face. "I just need some air, Dad," he muttered, his voice sounding thin and brittle. I'm suffocating here." Despite the sweltering August heat outside, he was dressed in heavy layers, his movements stiff, as if he were shivering from an internal frost. How do you beg a son to stay when you realize the person he's running from is standing right behind you? I reached out to touch his arm, but he pulled away with a sharp, involuntary jerk. Arya stepped forward, then her hand landing on Thane's shoulder with a grip that looked less like a caress and more like an invisible leash. "Take care of the boy while I'm gone," Arya Thane said, finally meeting her eyes. There was a desperate, pleading quality to his gaze that made my stomach turn. "I'll take care of everyone, Thane," she replied, her smile never reaching her cold, calculating eyes. "Don't worry about a thing. Go find your peace." I followed them out to the driveway, leaning heavily on the doorframe, as the SUV pulled away, disappearing into the thick mountain mist. The SUV vanished. The silence returned. The cage was locked. Arya didn't even look at me as she turned back toward the house. Her mask dropped the instant the taillights were out of sight, replaced by a look of pure clinical efficiency. She immediately began moving through the living room, sanitizing the space, straightening cushions I hadn't touched, wiping down surfaces with a bleach-heavy solution that stung my nostrils. It was as if she were erasing any trace of Thane's presence, or perhaps preparing the stage for the next act. I retreated to my room, the heavy scent of her lavender candles now a physical threat in the air. Time seemed to stretch and warp under the influence of the toxins in my blood. I drifted into a shallow, uneasy sleep, only to be jolted awake at midnight by a sound that bypassed my logic and struck straight at my soul. A blood-curdling scream erupted from Owen's bedroom across the hall. I scrambled out of bed, my joints screaming in protest as I rushed to his side. I found my 6-year-old grandson, Owen Kendrick, sitting bolt upright in his bed, his small face pale and slick with a cold, clammy sweat. He was hyperventilating, his tiny hand pointing frantically at the dark window. "The Star People, Grandpa." He wailed, his voice a jagged glass shard, cutting through the heavy, lavender-scented lies of the house. They were tapping on the glass. "They have stars on their hands. They said it's almost time." I pulled him into my arms, feeling the frantic hummingbird beat of his heart against my chest. Shh, Owen. I'm here. I won't let the stars touch you, I whispered, though my own heart was racing with a protective rage. He buried his face in my neck, sobbing about figures in hoods who carried a heavy stone and whispered in the dark. My mind flashed back to the robed sentinels I'd seen through the peephole. This wasn't a nightmare. Owen was witnessing the preparations for the ninth offering. I gently pulled back the sleeve of his pajamas to wipe his face, and that's when the world tilted on its axis. On the soft, pale skin of his inner wrist was a tiny temporary tattoo of a 7-pointed star. It was the same symbol from the cult files Garrison had described, a mark of ownership placed there by Arya while the boy slept. Owen's scream was a jagged glass shard cutting through the heavy lavender-scented lies of the house. I realized then that the wolves weren't just at the door, they were already marking the lambs. My son was a coward, my daughter-in-law was a monster, and my grandson was a variable they had already solved. I held Owen tighter, my eyes locking on the dark window where he claimed to have seen the star people. I wasn't just a grandfather anymore. I was a man with a target on his chest and a child in his arms, and I realized I had exactly until the full moon to find the weapon that would break this circle once and for all. I pulled back the sleeve of Owen's pajamas and felt the world tilt as I stared at the ink-black star on his skin, realizing the wolves weren't just at the door. They were already marking the lambs. The innocence of a child's drawing is usually a sanctuary, but in Owen's hands, the black crayon had become a tool for documenting a murder plot. I sat on the edge of my grandson's bed, my eyes burning as I stared at the 7-pointed mark on his wrist. The boy was breathing heavily now, the terror of the star people still vibrating through his small frame. I had spent my career looking for the smoking gun in balance sheets and tax havens, but the most damning piece of evidence I'd ever found was currently tucked under a 6-year-old's mattress. Owen reached down and pulled a hidden sketchbook from the gap between his slats and the box spring. He flipped through the pages with a clinical detachment that made my stomach turn. "This is the secret game, Grandpa," he whispered, his voice small and fragile. "Mommy says you need your special coffee so you won't be scared when the friends come to play." He stopped on a page that looked like a blueprint for an execution. It was a circle of elongated hooded figures standing around a central stone slab. On that slab, a crude stick figure lay with its arms spread wide. "That's you in the middle, Grandpa. You're the king of the hill." A stone slab, a curved knife. My grandson's art shouldn't look like an autopsy report. My mind flashed back to the basement, the heavy rhythmic thudding I'd heard weeks ago that Arya had dismissed as plumbing repairs. I realized now they were installing the altar. "Owen," I said, forcing my voice to remain low and steady despite the roar of blood in my ears. "Did Daddy help Mommy with the stone?" The boy nodded, his eyes wide and honest. "Daddy helped carry it. He was crying, but Mommy told him it would make us rich. She said the stars would bring us all the money in the world, so we could move to the big house with the gold gates." The nauseating clarity of it hit me like a physical blow. Thane hadn't just stood by. He had been the muscle for the cult's logistics. What is the price of a father's life in the currency of a son's greed? I felt a cold, crystalline rage replacing the initial shock. I wasn't just a grandfather in that moment. I was a hunter who had finally found the scent of the wolf. I reached into my robe and pulled out my smartphone, the blue light reflecting off Owen's pale face. I began to photograph every page of that sketchbook, the shutter sound muffled by the heavy mountain wind outside. Owen watched me, his head tilted. "It's our secret, right, Grandpa?" he asked. "Yes, Owen, our secret. I'm going to win the game for us." I promised, my heart breaking even as my resolve hardened into iron. As I scrolled through the images, I saw a drawing of 3 men without their hoods. Owen had drawn them with specific details. One had a gold watch with a green face, another had a very high forehead, and a voice like a growling bear. I recognized those descriptions. They were local prominent figures from the Asheville Country Club men I had shared scotch with years ago. The circle wasn't just a fringe group of fanatics. It was a parasitic network woven into the very fabric of the city's elite. I realized the men in hoods Owen described had voices I recognized, implying the cult had deep roots I hadn't even begun to untangle. This wasn't just a family betrayal. It was a professional liquidation by a coordinated cell. I carefully replaced the sketchbook under the mattress and tucked the covers around Owen's chin. His breathing began to even out, the exhaustion of the night finally claiming him. I stayed there for a long time, watching the rise and fall of his chest, knowing that the man he called Daddy had authorized the very sedation that made these nightmares possible. Daddy told me not to worry, Owen had said. He said the coffee makes you happy. I stood up, my joints no longer feeling like lead, but like coiled springs. The poison was still there, but the truth was a powerful antagonist. I stepped back into the hallway. The floorboards didn't just creak. They seemed to groan under the weight of the photos now sitting in my pocket. Proof that my own blood had signed my death warrant for a few pieces of gold. I moved toward the stairs, my eyes scanning the darkness for the infrared glow of the microphones I now knew were there. I had to get to the basement. I had to find the forged power of attorney that Arya was using to dismantle my estate. If Thane was the muscle and Arya was the brain, then the circle was the belly, and it was currently trying to digest my life's work. I reached the landing and paused, listening for the sound of Arya's breathing or the rustle of her silk robe. The house was a theater of shadows, and I was the lead actor who had finally read the ending of the script. I wasn't going to let the curtain fall on the ninth offering, not while I still had a breath in my lungs and a child to protect. I looked at the basement door, a dark, rectangular void at the end of the hall. The keys were gone, the locks were changed, but Arya had forgotten one thing. I had spent 30 years breaking into places that people like her thought were secure. The floorboards groaned again, a warning I took to heart. I began my descent, one agonizingly silent step at a time, moving toward the heart of the betrayal. I was no longer a victim of age or chemistry. I was a man who had seen the star on the lamb and the knife in the sun's hand, and I was going to burn their circle to the ground before the moon reached its peak. The lock on Thane's basement office didn't stand a chance against the set of tension wrenches I'd kept hidden in my old shaving kit for 15 years. I waited for the house to fall completely silent, counting the minutes until Arya's rhythmic, chemical-assisted breathing signaled she was under. My bare feet felt the vibration of the house, the low hum of the furnace, the distant groan of mountain timber as I descended into the dark. I moved with the muscle memory of a man who had spent his prime navigating the shadows of corporate high-rises. Entering the office, I didn't reach for the light switch. I used a small, high-intensity LED pen light, shielding the beam with my palm as I began a careful search through my son's private space. It didn't take long to find something deeply troubling. Tucked inside a false-bottom desk drawer was a thick legal folder. I opened it, and the first thing I saw was a power of attorney form. My signature looked perfect, a masterpiece of forgery that only a cold-blooded professional could produce. It was dated July 15th, the very week I first felt the fog begin to settle over my brain. Beneath it lay a life insurance policy with a face value of $5.8 million. Arya and Thane were the sole beneficiaries. Is it still paranoia if the documents in your hand prove you're worth more dead than alive? The mathematics of the betrayal were clinical. I realized that the power of attorney wasn't just for medical decisions. It's already been used to initiate the sale of my family estate, meaning the clock isn't just ticking, it's nearly at midnight. I felt a surge of analytical fury. They weren't just waiting for me to die. They were actively clearing the shelf to make room for the next harvest. I dug deeper into the folder, finding a smaller, more weathered envelope. Inside was a genuine death certificate for a woman named Rebecca Ann Bishop. She was Owen's mother, my son's first wife. The cause of death was listed as a fall down basement stairs 5 years ago. My hand trembled, but not from age. Right next to it was a newspaper clipping from 2018, a report of a car fire in a different state. The victim was the real Aria Redmond, a wealthy socialite with no surviving heirs. The death certificate was a cold, white tombstone sitting on a desk made of mahogany and lies. Rebecca wasn't just my son's wife. She was the mother of my grandson, and they'd replaced her like a broken appliance. I stared at the photo of the socialite in the clipping. The woman sleeping upstairs had stolen a dead woman's name to walk into my life and dismantle it. Who are you, Aria, or whatever your name is, in the dark? I took out my phone and began photographing every page, the digital shutter sound, feeling like a gunshot in the cramped office. I documented the forged signatures, the insurance policies, and the evidence of Rebecca's suspicious end. I was building a dossier of a ghost. Just as I was about to close the drawer, the floorboards above me gave a sharp, distinctive creak. I froze, my light clicking off instantly. Silence. Then the first step. Then the second. It was the unmistakable click-clack of Aria's heels moving toward the basement door. She wasn't supposed to be awake. I realized then that the cloyingly sweet candles weren't for my peace. They were a sensory tripwire I must have disturbed. I scrambled my joints, screaming to find cover. I tucked the folder back exactly as I'd found it, using the penlight for a split second to ensure the dust patterns remained undisturbed. The door at the top of the stairs groaned open. I dove behind the massive humming furnace, the oily smell of old grease and dust filling my lungs. I held my breath until my lungs screamed, the furnace's heat a physical weight against my back. As Aria stood at the top of the stairs, she isn't calling out in concern. She's humming a low, dissonant chant, the same one Owen described from The Secret Game. It was a sound devoid of humanity, a rhythmic, predatory drone that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Warren, are you down there?" Her voice was a soft, melodic threat that didn't match the darkness of her song. I pressed myself flatter against the metal casing of the furnace, the heat seeping through my robe. I watched through a gap in the machinery as the beam of her own flashlight began to sweep the concrete floor. The light moved slowly, methodically, searching for the variable that had dared to move out of its assigned place. I was a P. I again cornered in a den of thieves, but this time the thieves were the people I had called family. Aria's shadow lengthened across the concrete floor, a dark, sharp-edged needle pointing straight toward my hiding spot behind the furnace. The shadow was tall, distorted by the angle of the stairs, looking like one of the hooded figures from Owen's sketchbook. She took a step down, then another. I felt the sweat trickling down my spine, my heart hammering against the furnace's vibration. I looked at the side exit, a small bulkhead door used for bringing in coal years ago. It was 10 feet away across open ground. If she reached the bottom of the stairs, she would see me. I had to time it. I had to be a shadow among shadows. Aria paused on the third step from the bottom, her flashlight lingering on the office door I had just locked. She didn't move. She just stood there humming that God-forsaken tune, as if she could sense the lingering heat of my presence in the air. I closed my eyes, focusing every ounce of my 72-year-old will into remaining perfectly, deathly still. The furnace gave a loud metallic clank as the pilot light flickered, providing a momentary mask for the sound of my own ragged breathing. Aria's shadow hovered the needlepoint of her darkness, dancing inches from my feet. I realized that if I survived this night, I was no longer fighting for an inheritance or a house. I was fighting to stop a cycle of death that had already claimed one Kendrick wife and was currently looking for a Kendrick father. I waited until the rhythmic vibration of Aria's heels receded back into the kitchen before I slipped out the basement's bulkhead door and into the biting chill of the Asheville night. The humid mountain air hit my face like a cold towel, momentarily stripping away the chemical lethargy that had been my constant companion. I didn't take my primary vehicle. I walked 2 blocks to a hidden key safe I'd kept for emergencies and took the old nondescript sedan I'd used for surveillance back in the 90s. I drove toward downtown Asheville, the city lights blurred by the mist, until I found a 24-hour convenience store that smelled of cheap coffee and gasoline. My hands were steady as I purchased a burner phone, my movements driven by the cold, mathematical precision of a man who had finally found the thread. I sat in my car in the far corner of the parking lot, the hum of the engine a low, comforting growl in the empty silence. My heart hammered against my ribs, but for the first time in months, it wasn't from the poison. I dialed a number I hadn't touched in 15 years. A sequence of digits burned into my brain alongside the memories of our final disastrous case. "Garrison," I said, as the line clicked open. "It's Warren. I'm out of the house. We need to talk." The silence on the other end lasted for exactly 4 seconds. "I've been waiting for this call for 10 years, Kendrick." The voice replied, a gravelly, nicotine-stained rasp that I recognized instantly. "I thought you were already dead." Garrison Price hadn't changed, at least not in spirit. He told me that his warning call earlier that morning hadn't been a random act of guilt. He revealed that it was triggered because Aria's real phone, the one she keeps hidden, had just pinged a known cult safehouse Garrison was monitoring as part of an internal affairs investigation. How many other families had been fed into the furnace of the Circle's greed while I sat in my garden drinking their poison? Garrison's voice sharpened as I described the death certificate for Rebecca Bishop and the clipping of the socialite Aria Redmond. He didn't sound surprised. He sounded vindicated. "She's not just an imposter, Warren." He explained the sound of a match striking through the speaker. "She's a professional widow. She leaves a trail of burnt-out estates and accidental deaths across 3 states. We call them the Circle of Nine. They're a predatory occult group that targets wealthy, isolated seniors using their own family members as the delivery system." My throat went dry. My own son, Garrison. How Garrison sighed a heavy, weary sound. Thane didn't just stumble into this. They scouted his gambling debts over $1.4 million in professional arrears and offered him a way out that required your blood. They turned him into a tool, Warren. He's been their inside man for months. Thane, my son, my legacy. He was the one who handed them the keys. The crystalline rage I felt was tempered only by Garrison's professional focus. He told me that Thane's phone records showed he'd been in contact with the cult leader, a man named Damien, since January. The betrayal began months before the first dose of benzodiazepines ever touched my coffee. Garrison confessed that he had joined IA specifically to hunt this group after the Ramirez case in 2010, the very case that had destroyed our partnership. We thought it was just a botched embezzlement, but it was a circle operation we were too blind to see back then. He told me he wouldn't let another family be dismantled on his watch, especially not mine. "We have until the full moon on September 7th. Garrison said, his voice dropping to a low, authoritative level. "That's the 0 hour. That's when they finalize the sacrifice. I owe you my life for what happened in 2010, Warren. I won't let you die alone in that house." We spent the next 20 minutes forming the plan. I would return to the estate and begin a performance of decay, acting out the final stages of the poisoning, to lure them into a false sense of victory. Garrison's voice was a lifeline thrown into a rising tide of black ink. He would coordinate a surveillance team to plant micro cameras in the house under the guise of a telecom repair. I looked at the blue, sterile glow of the burner phone screen, the light reflecting off my weathered face in the rearview mirror. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting for my life anymore. I was fighting to salvage whatever was left of my son's soul, if any piece of it remained beneath the debt and the lies. The biting, humid chill of the night air seemed to seep through the car windows as Garrison delivered his final instructions. "Do not deviate from the script, Warren. If they suspect you know they won't wait for the 7th. They'll finish you tonight." I hung up the phone and looked at my trembling hands in the dashboard light. The hum of the car engine felt like a countdown. I had to go back into the mouth of the wolf, but this time I wasn't going in as a victim. I was the architect of my own survival. I drove back toward the mountains, the city lights fading behind me, like a life I was no longer permitted to live. As I pulled back into my neighborhood, the Kendrick estate looked like a tomb in the moonlight, its windows dark and unreadable. I parked the old sedan blocks away and walked back through the forest, my bare feet silent on the pine needles. I slipped back through the bulkhead door, the oily smell of the furnace welcoming me back to my cage. I climbed the stairs with the stealth of a thief, my mind already calculating the next move. I looked at my trembling hands in the dashboard light, realizing that I wasn't just fighting for my life anymore. I was fighting to salvage whatever was left of my son's soul. To save my life, I had to become the very thing I feared most, a frail, forgetful old man who couldn't remember what he'd had for breakfast. I pulled back into the driveway of the Kendrick estate, just as the first bruised purple of dawn began to bleed through the mountain mist. My heart gave a sharp, painful thud when I looked up and saw Arya standing at the second-story window. She was a silhouette against the pale light, motionless and watching. I didn't rush. I moved with a deliberate, heavy-footed shuffle, leaning my weight against the car door as I stepped out, making sure my hand shook just enough when I reached for my keys. I had to sell the performance. I had to make her believe that her slow-motion execution of my mind was succeeding. By the time I reached the kitchen, I was wearing the scratchy wool of my old shuffling slippers, the sound of them dragging across the hardwood, acting as a metronome for my fabricated decline. Arya was already there, the picture of morning grace in her silk robe, a fresh pot of coffee already steaming on the counter. I stood in the doorway, staring blankly at the toaster, as if I were trying to solve a complex mathematical proof. "I'm sorry, dear," I murmured, rubbing my eyes with a hand that trembled with practiced precision. "Did you say it was Tuesday or Wednesday?" Arya turned a soft, patronizing smile curling her lips. "It's Thursday, Warren. Don't worry, the fog will clear soon. Why don't you go sit in the living room while I get your breakfast ready?" I watched her eyes as she spoke. There was a hidden satisfaction there, a cold glint of triumph that she couldn't quite mask. How much of myself did I have to erase before she believed I was truly gone? I sank into my armchair, letting my jaw slacken slightly, the perfect image of a man whose lights were flickering out. The psychological warfare had begun, and I was determined to be the superior tactician in my own house. The next afternoon provided the opportunity Garrison and I had discussed. A white van with the Asheville Telecom logo pulled into the drive. I was in the garden with Arya standing near a row of hydrangeas that I had spent the previous night sabotaging with a concentrated saline solution. The flowers were turning a sickly, mottled black, their petals rotting on the stem. The flowers, they're turning black, Arya. I said, my voice thin and wavering. Just like my memory. I can't remember when I last watered them. Arya glanced at the dying plants, then back at me, her mask of sympathy firmly in place. "It's just the soil, Warren. The acidity must be off. Go back inside and rest. Let the technicians work on the line." Garrison's undercover team, dressed in high-visibility vests, moved with professional speed, while I kept Arya occupied with a rambling, nonsensical story about my late wife's gardening habits. I heard the faint, high-pitched electronic whine of a micro-camera being activated inside the house. The technicians were planting the Trojan horses, one in the vintage kitchen clock and another in the smoke detector in the foyer. The clock ticked, but it wasn't just measuring time anymore. It was watching. During our conversation in the garden, Arya mentioned a specific detail about how my dead wife used to dry her herbs in the attic, a detail that only I and the real Arya should have known. It was a chilling revelation. She had meticulously studied our family history, likely through stolen journals or recordings, to ensure her imposter's mask was seamless. I felt a cold sweat prickle my neck, but I maintained my confused stare, nodding along to her lies. By midnight, the house was silent. I retreated to the master bedroom, locking the door, and turning on the white noise machine to mask any sound I might make. I pulled the burner phone from its hiding place inside a hollowed-out book and opened the encrypted app Garrison had installed. The grainy grayscale quality of the night vision camera feed flickered to life. I was looking through the kitchen clock, and for the first time I saw the real Aria Redmond. She was stripped of her loving mask, her face a cold, clinical mask of efficiency. She was at the counter, a mortar and pestle in her hands. I watched as she methodically crushed a handful of blue pills into a fine powder, her movements rhythmic and practiced. She began mixing the powder into a fresh batch of coffee grounds, her lips moving, as she hummed a dissonant, low-frequency chant. It was the same sound Owen had described the music of the Star People. I saw the real you, Aria. Cold, efficient, and utterly devoid of mercy. The blue light of the phone screen made my own face look like a ghost's as I recorded the evidence. Aria's smile on the screen was a predator's grin caught in the amber of digital surveillance. I watched her work for nearly 20 minutes, documenting the preparation of my morning poison. She moved with a frightening grace, her eyes occasionally darting toward the hallway, as if she could sense my observation. Then my blood turned to ice. On the screen, Aria stopped her grinding. She stood perfectly still. Then slowly, very slowly, she turned her head toward the kitchen clock. She leaned in close, her eyes wide and reflecting the tiny lens of the hidden camera. A slow, terrifying smile spread across her face, not the patronizing smile of a caregiver, but the wide, dark grin of a hunter who knows exactly where the prey is hiding. She leaned in close to the clock, her eyes wide and reflecting the tiny lens, and for one heartbeat, I was certain she was looking right through the glass and into my soul. I watched Aria turn away from the camera, her smile vanishing as quickly as a light being switched off. And I knew I had exactly 48 hours to move $7 million before the circle made my death official. My heart, which had seemed to stop when her eyes locked onto the lens, finally resumed a heavy thumping rhythm. I realized then that I was a variable she hadn't quite solved yet. She suspected the house was bugged, but she didn't know for certain, and in that gap of uncertainty lay my only chance for a counterstrike. I forced myself to wait until the house settled into its morning routine. Aria was preoccupied with Owen's school preparations, her voice a soft, melodic contrast to the predatory intent I had witnessed on the screen. I utilized that rare window of opportunity to tell her I needed to visit the local library, to look up some old genealogy records, a perfect cover for a senile man obsessed with his fading past. Instead, I drove straight to my bank in downtown Asheville. The sterile, recirculated air of the bank vault felt safer than the atmosphere of my own home. I sat in a private booth, the rhythmic thumping of my pulse loud in my ears, as I initiated a series of complex transfers. I moved the $5.8 million insurance payout and my personal savings, nearly $7 million in total, into an irrevocable trust for my grandson. I want this trust locked. I told the bank manager, my voice cold and absolute. No one touches it until Owen is 25, not even me. I left exactly enough in the original accounts to keep the balance looking normal to a casual observer, a thin veneer of wealth to keep the parasites fed while I hollowed out the core. Have you ever felt the physical weight of a $7 million lie sitting in your pocket? The receipt for the transfer felt heavier than lead as I tucked it into my inner pocket. The paper I left behind was just a ghost of a fortune, a mathematical echo of a life they thought they had already conquered. Tactical satisfaction warmed me for the first time in months. I was no longer just the prey. I was the one setting the trap. Returning to the house required every ounce of my PI training to maintain the mask of a man losing his grip. I spent the afternoon in the basement, taking advantage of Thane's absence and Aria's gardening. I opened the safe. I had accessed nights before the dry, dusty smell of the interior hitting me as I pulled out the original asset documentation. I had spent the previous night preparing high-quality duplicates using my old forgery kits from my investigator days to create falsified values. I replaced the real deeds and account statements with these blank husks, ensuring the dust patterns remained undisturbed. "It's a shell game, Thane," I whispered to the empty room. "And you were always the easiest mark." My signature on these new forms was a forgery of my own life, a perfect imitation of a dying man's hand. The bank transfer was a digital scalpel, cutting the tether between my family's future and the parasites in the living room. I realized then that Arya was picking at empty husks, dreaming of a harvest that no longer existed. But the victory was short-lived. Later that evening, while scanning the secure satellite phone traffic through the hidden cameras, I found a new folder of recorded audio. I retreated to my master bedroom, the scratch of my fountain pen on a transcription notebook, the only sound in the room. The high-pitched metallic hiss of the voice recording filled my ears, as Arya confirmed the ritual details with the cult leader Damien. "The vessel is ready," Arya's voice said, stripped of its warmth. "The bloodline is compliant. 0 hour is confirmed for the full moon on September 7th at Jagged Gorge." I felt a surge of existential dread. $7 million will cleanse a lot of sins, won't it, Damien? The voice on the other end, deep and resonant, chilled me to the bone. He didn't just want the money. Damien revealed that the Circle believed my past as a fraud investigator made my cleansing more spiritually valuable because I had once hunted the truth. I was being scheduled for execution with the clinical indifference of a dental appointment. 0 hour, September 7th. My expiration date. I transcribes every word, my hand shaking, as I documented my own murder plot. The reality of the Circle's reach became even more terrifying, as I unearthed a series of stolen credentials Arya had been using. She hadn't just been drugging me. She had been using my digital identity to redirect Owen's legal guardianship to a third-party entity controlled by the cult. They were going to take the boy and the money, and then they were going to erase the man who knew their names. I realized they weren't just killing me for the wealth, they were killing me to stop the only man who knew how to find them. I closed the transcription notebook, the finality of the information settling over me like a shroud. I was a ghost in my own home, a man who had already moved his fortune out of reach, but was still tied to the altar. I looked at my reflection in the dark window, seeing a gaunt, resolute figure staring back. The performance of my life was about to enter its final act, and the stakes were no longer just my survival. I had to become the very thing they feared, a hunter who knew the truth. I closed the transcription notebook, my fingers trembling as the final realization hit me. They weren't just killing me for the wealth, they were killing me to stop the only man who knew how to find them. To get the truth out of my veins, I first had to convince Arya that I was dying right in front of her. The preparation had been as meticulous as a surgical strike. For 3 days, I had been surreptitiously disposing of the antioxidant coffee she provided, replacing it with weak decaf I'd hidden in my study. Yet I allowed the physical tremors to worsen in my public performance. I needed her to believe the saturation point had been reached. On the morning of August 22nd, I sat in the breakfast nook, the cold porcelain feel of the plate against my cheek already mapped out in my mind. I watched Arya Redmond across the table, her poise perfect, her eyes tracing the slight artificial rattle of my fork against the ceramic. I chose my moment when she reached for the marmalade. I let out a sharp, choked gasp, my hand fling to my chest in a spasmodic clutch. I made sure to knock my orange juice over the glass, shattering a chaotic punctuation mark to my collapse. I slumped forward, my face hitting the edge of the plate with a dull thud. Through half-closed eyes, I watched her. For 3 seconds, she didn't move. I saw a flash of pure cold annoyance cross her face, the look of a woman whose morning schedule had been inconvenienced by a faulty piece of machinery. I realized then that I had been a mathematical certainty to her, and my early expiration was a variable she hadn't accounted for. She waited. 1 minute. 2. I stayed perfectly still, shallowing my breath until my lungs burned. Finally, I heard her chair scrape back. She didn't check my pulse. She checked the time. It was only after a full 4 minutes of silence that she picked up the phone, her voice instantly transforming into the high-pitched, frantic vibrato of a terrified caregiver. "Warren. Oh God, Warren, stay with me!" she shrieked for the benefit of the recorded 911 line. I felt her hands on my chest, performing a frantic, useless version of CPR. I felt my heart hammering, not from a blockage, but from the terror of her hands on my body, the very touch of the person who had been systematically erasing me. The paramedics arrived with a roar of sirens and the heavy thud of equipment bags. I remained limp, a passenger in my own staged tragedy, as they loaded me into the ambulance. Arya insisted on riding in the back, her face a mask of tearful devotion that would have fooled any jury in the state. The ride to the medical clinic was a claustrophobic nightmare. Every siren wail felt like a countdown to my exposure. I lay beneath the heavy hospital blanket, my hand surreptitiously finding the burner phone I had taped to my inner thigh earlier that morning. With the practiced movements of a man who had spent years in surveillance vans, I navigated the keypad by touch alone. I sent the pre-written text to Garrison. "The fish is on the hook. Send the nurse." Red lights and blue lights strobed against the interior of the ambulance, a rhythmic, frantic pulse that matched the stakes of the game. Before I reveal the truth behind the double vial trick that saved my life, are you still with me? Comment A, if you think I should trust the law, or B, if I should take matters into my own hands. And give me one short reason why. Please note the following scene contains dramatized medical details added for narrative impact. The message is what matters. If this level of tension is not for you, feel free to stop here. The ER was a blur of antiseptic smells and the rhythmic mechanical chirp of heart monitors. I was wheeled into a private bay, the fluorescent lights stinging my eyes as I maintained my semi-conscious state. Arya was a constant shadow at my bedside, her hand clutching mine with a grip that felt like a shackle. She was playing the role of the grieving wife to perfection, but I knew she was waiting for a doctor she controlled to finish what she had started. Then the curtain slid back. Nurse Elena, a woman with steady hands and the sharp, observant eyes of someone who worked frequently with Garrison's internal affairs team, moved with a clinical efficiency that hid her true purpose. She didn't look at me, but I saw the slight professional nod she gave toward the hallway where Garrison was waiting. "I need to perform a sterile blood draw immediately." Elena announced, her voice a sharp, authoritative snap that brooked no argument. "Ma'am, I need you to step behind the curtain for the sterile draw. Hospital policy." Arya hesitated, her eyes narrowing as she scanned Elena's face. For a heartbeat, the air in the room felt like it was made of glass, ready to shatter. Arya opened her mouth to protest, but Elena was already positioning the tray, her movements creating a physical barrier. Arya finally stepped back, the rustle of her silk robe a lingering threat as the curtain clicked shut. Elena moved with the speed of a combat medic. I felt the sharp, stinging bite of the butterfly needle as she found the vein. She didn't draw one vial, she drew two. The first went into the standard hospital rack. The second, she slipped into a lead-lined pouch inside her scrub pocket. "Garrison has the lab on standby," she whispered, her breath warm against my ear. "We'll have the proof by tonight. Just hold on, Warren." As Nurse Elena left, the tension in my chest began to ease, a clandestine victory in the heart of the enemy's territory. But the relief was short-lived. I watched the curtain pull back again, expecting Arya, but instead a different doctor entered the room. He was a tall man with a face like a mask of professional concern, but as he reached out to adjust my IV, I felt a jolt of pure, icy adrenaline. I recognized him. He was the figure from the corner of Owen's sketchbook, the man Owen had drawn standing over the stone slab. The doctor leaned over me, his face a mask of professional concern, but as his hand touched my arm, I saw the edge of a 7-pointed star peeking out from beneath his white cuff. I kept my breathing shallow and my eyes unfocused, playing the part of a man whose lights were flickering out even as the tattooed star on the doctor's wrist burned into my memory. The smell of ozone and hospital disinfectant hung heavy in the air, a sterile shroud that offered no comfort. This man with his stethoscope and his polished bedside manner was one of them. He wasn't checking my health, he was checking the progress of the harvest. His fingers were cold as he gripped my forearm, his thumb pressing down right next to the 7-pointed brand hidden beneath his cuff. "Focus on my finger, Warren," he said, his voice a smooth, practiced baritone. "Can you feel the numbness spreading?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. I let my head loll to the side, my gaze drifting toward the ceiling tiles. I needed to ensure that he didn't detect the double vial trick Elena had just performed. If he checked my other arm too closely, he might see the second puncture mark. My years as a forensic investigator had taught me how to control my physiological responses, how to keep my pulse steady and my skin dry even when every instinct was screaming for me to bolt. He squeezed my wrist. Hard. A warning, not a pulse check. It was a silent communication between predator and prey, a reminder that within these white walls I was entirely within his jurisdiction. He moved his light across my pupils, the beam stinging like a physical needle searching for the chemical submission Arya had been feeding me. I gave him exactly what he wanted, a slow, sluggish reaction. Satisfied, he stepped back and whispered something to Arya in the corner. I was still a compliant vessel. 2 days later, the hospital discharged me, citing a transient ischemic attack brought on by stress and age. It was a perfect medical lie to keep me isolated. I arranged to meet Garrison at a secluded park in North Asheville, a place where the mountain laurel was thick enough to hide 100 ghosts. The afternoon sun was weak, filtered through a heavy canopy of oak trees. Garrison didn't waste time with pleasantries. He handed me a plain manila envelope. The paper inside felt crisp and cold. "It's all here, Warren," he said, his voice low and jagged. "You're walking around with enough sedative in you to put down a horse." The toxicology report was undeniable: lorazepam and diazepam at toxic levels. My gums weren't bleeding because of age. They were bleeding because my blood was being thinned by a chemical onslaught. How do you breathe normally when you're holding the proof of your own slow-motion murder in a manila envelope? I looked at the numbers on the page, the chemical names laid out in a precise, lethal list. "Blood doesn't lie, Garrison," I whispered. "But it doesn't stand up in a corrupt court either." Garrison nodded, his jaw tight. He revealed that Elena, the nurse who had helped me, had gone missing the previous night. Her apartment was empty. The cult had realized someone had interfered with the sterile draw, and they were already cleaning up the loose ends. "We need a caught-in-the-act moment, Warren. The Circle has local judges in their pocket. If we move now on just this report, they'll have it suppressed. You have to go back." I took the manila envelope and tucked it into my inner coat pocket, the weight of it feeling like a shield. I returned to the estate, the performance of decay, now fueled by a cold, genuine terror. On September 1st, the final phase of their legal theft arrived. Arya entered the living room, followed by a man she introduced as her family lawyer. I recognized him the moment he spoke. It was Damien, the voice from the satellite recording. Damien, the cult leader masquerading as a high-priced estate lawyer, carried a gaunt, skeletal elegance and a deep voice that felt like it resonated from the bottom of a well. He sat across from me, his presence in my living room like a serpent coiled on my favorite armchair, smelling of expensive cologne and ancient rot. He placed a stack of papers on the mahogany coffee table, the final property transfer documents that would strip me of everything I hadn't already moved into Owen's trust. "It's just a standard signature," Warren, Arya said, her hand resting on my shoulder. Her touch felt like a lead weight. "Just for the insurance adjustment." Damien leaned forward, unscrewing the cap of an antique fountain pen. The black ink inside looked like a pool of obsidian. "You think you're in control until the pen touches the paper. Then you realize you're just the ink." I looked at the lines where my name was supposed to go. My hand was shaking, and for once I didn't have to fake it. I could feel the pressure of their combined gazes, a suffocating force intended to crush my resistance. I reached for the pen, my fingers fumbling. I looked at Damien, seeing the predatory hunger behind his lawyer's mask. I waited until the very tip of the nib touched the white paper. Then I let out a sharp, guttural groan and pitched forward. I didn't just fall. I made sure my arm swept across the table with a violent jerk. My sleeve caught the open inkwell, sending it flying. I watched the black ink bleed across the forged contract, a beautiful mess that bought me another night of life. The viscous stain spread across the documents, obscuring the signature lines. I collapsed onto the floor, the cold hardwood biting into my cheek. Arya shrieked in frustration. I felt the cold floor against my cheek, the ink staining my hands like the very sins Arya was trying to harvest. I lay there, eyes rolled back, listening to them scramble. Damien's voice lost its polished baritone, turning into a vicious snarl. "Clean this up," he snapped at Arya. "We don't have time for another medical delay. The full moon is in 6 days." As he turned to leave, he paused at the threshold. I remained perfectly still. Damien looked back at my unconscious form with a gaze so predatory, I felt the hair on my neck rise. He didn't care about the ink anymore. He was already thinking about the blood. Then he leaned down and muttered something to Arya in a dissonant, rhythmic chant that seemed to vibrate in the floorboards. It wasn't about the money anymore. The legal documents were only a secondary plan. The 9th offering was the primary goal. Damien paused at the threshold, looking back at my unconscious form with a gaze so predatory, I felt the hair on my neck rise. He didn't care about the ink. He was already thinking about the blood. The silver service was polished to a mirror finish, but all I could see in the reflection was a family of ghosts sitting down to a meal of lies. The dining room of the Kendrick estate had been transformed into a theater of the macabre for this final formal family dinner on September 3rd. Arya had spent the afternoon draping the room in heavy velvet and lighting thick, unscented candles that cast flickering orange shadows against the oak-paneled walls. I sat at the head of the table, maintaining my posture of chemical defeat, while Thane sat opposite me looking skeletal and refusing to meet my eye. He had returned from his camping trip, a broken man, his skin sallow and his fingers twitching with a rhythmic, nervous energy. Arya moved with the grace of a high priestess, her silk robe rustling like dry leaves as she poured a deep, ruby-colored wine into our crystal goblets. To family, she set her voice a melodic contrast to the predatory intent I knew lived behind her eyes, and to the peace that comes when the work is finally done. She claimed it was a heart-strengthening vintage from a local valley, but I knew the scent of her alchemy by now. Beneath the heavy metallic fruit of the wine was the faint, acrid tang of a paralytic. How do you swallow the wine when you know the toast is for your own funeral? I lifted the glass to my lips, my hand shaking with practiced precision. "Thane, you're shaking," I said, my voice thin and wavering. "Is the mountain air too thin for you?" My son flinched as if I'd struck him. He looked at his own glass, then at Arya, then finally at the floor. "Don't look at me like that, Dad," he whispered, his voice sounding like it was being squeezed from a dry sponge. "Just drink your wine. It's for the best." I watched him searching for a single spark of the boy I used to take fishing at Lake Julian, but I only found a man who had sold his soul for a ledger. He was a prisoner of the Circle's debt, caught in a vice of guilt and fear that had flattened his humanity. Arya had stepped into the kitchen to retrieve the main course, leaving us in a heavy, suffocating silence. I looked at Thane, pouring every ounce of my true self into a single, piercing stare. I wanted him to see that I was still there. Still his father, still a man who would have forgiven anything but the betrayal of his own blood. But he remained catatonic, his gaze locked on the silver fork in front of him. The glass touched my lips. Cold. Final. A liquid deadbolt. I didn't drink. As Arya returned, I used a hidden ultra-absorbent napkin I had stitched into my sleeve to soak up the ruby liquid while maintaining the illusion of a deep swallow. I set the glass down, letting my eyes glaze over. The performance had to be flawless. I staged a gradual collapse, letting my chin drop toward my chest and my breathing become heavy and labored. Arya watched me with clinical interest, checking her watch. "He's under," she said, her voice stripping away the warmth of the loving daughter-in-law. "The ninth offering is ready for the moon." Thane stood up his chair, scraping violently against the floorboards. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice cracking. Arya didn't answer with words. She simply nodded toward me. "Help me get him upstairs." What followed was a terrifying intimacy I will never forget. I remained completely limp, a dead weight in the hands of my executioners. Thane took my shoulders, his grip tight and desperate, while Arya hauled my legs. They carried me up the grand staircase, my head lolling against Thane's suit jacket. I could feel the rough texture of the fabric and the frantic hummingbird beat of his heart through his chest. Being carried by Thane was like being held by a ghost, a man who had already died inside, leaving only a hollow shell to do the heavy lifting. We reached the master bedroom, and they tossed me onto the bed, with the indifference of movers handling a discarded sofa. 17 days, Arya muttered, smoothing her hair. "That's all we need to scrub the accounts clean once the vessel is cleansed." She began preparing the transport materials, her movements efficient and cold. Thane didn't help her. He stood by the window, staring out at the darkening Blue Ridge peaks. I remained perfectly still, my breathing shallow and rhythmic, until I heard them turn toward the door. Arya led the way, her heels clicking a sharp, victorious rhythm on the hardwood. Thane followed, but he paused at the threshold. The door clicked shut, leaving me in the dark. But the sound that broke the silence was the one that truly chilled me, my son. The architect of my demise weeping like a broken child in the hallway. I heard his voice crack in a jagged sob, a muffled confession that Mom died for nothing. It was the final confirmation of the first murder, a confession whispered to a closed door that he thought I could no longer hear. I lay there in the darkness, my heart hammering against my ribs with a renewed, icy purpose. The confirmation of Rebecca's murder didn't break me. It forged me into something harder than the stone they intended to lay me on. I had heard enough. The time for performance was nearly over, and the time for the counterstrike was at hand. I waited for the house to fall into its final predatory silence, knowing that the SUV would be arriving in 3 hours to take me to the gorge. My son was a shell, my daughter-in-law was a demon, and I was the ghost who was about to haunt them both. I lay perfectly still, listening to the rhythmic, agonizing sound of Thane's grief, realizing that the man in the hallway was already in a hell of his own making. Arya didn't speak when she returned. She simply grabbed my ankles and hauled my limp body toward the edge of the bed, like a side of beef destined for the cellar. I remained a prisoner of my own performance, forcing every muscle to remain slack, even as the rough movement threatened to jar my eyes open. I felt the shift in air pressure as she dragged me toward the door, my head lolling against the hardwood as we moved onto the landing. Thane was there, his breathing a series of wet, panicked hitches. I was carried downstairs, my back scraping against the carpet, before being hoisted up one last time. They tossed me into the back of the SUV, my face pressed against the cold, pebbled leather of the rear bench. I remained perfectly still, using the forensic breathing techniques I'd practiced for decades to regulate my heart rate, keeping it slow and thready. I heard Arya whispering into a burner phone, her voice a sharp, rhythmic hiss. "The 9 are in position," she said. "We're moving the vessel now. Keep the perimeter clear." Thane climbed into the driver's seat, the vehicle rocking under his weight. He was trembling so violently I could feel the vibration through the seat cushion. He started the engine, and as we pulled out of the gravel driveway, I realized this was the final cargo of my life's work, a body they intended to trade for a clean ledger. The SUV turned onto the winding mountain roads, the darkness outside absolute. How do you keep your breathing rhythmic when your own son is describing how he traded your life for a cleared ledger? During the winding drive up the Pisgah slopes, Thane finally began to unravel. He started talking to my unconscious form, his voice a jagged, sobbing wreck. "I'm so sorry, Dad." He choked out his words, punctuated by the rhythmic thumping of tires over deep forest ruts. "I thought I could fix it. I thought if I just let them have the house, they'd leave us alone. But Arya," she showed me the video. He let out a sound of pure, repulsive pity. He admitted he knew Arya had pushed Rebecca down the stairs 5 years ago. He had watched the footage. She took a blackmail insurance policy she'd held over him since the day Owen's mother died. He'd accepted the insurance money to cover his professional gambling debts, making him a physical accessory to the murder of his own wife. Confession is for the living. Tonight, I was the walking dead. I lay there absorbing the chilling confirmation of his cowardice. He wasn't just a victim. He was a silent partner in a 5-year-old grave. Arya didn't even try to comfort him. "Shut up, Thane," she snapped, her voice cutting through his grief like a scalpel. "He can't hear you, and the dead don't grant absolutions. Just keep your hands on the wheel. If you shake, we go off the cliff before the moon is even high enough." She casually mentioned that once I was cleansed, Owen would be sent to a special school in Europe, a cult indoctrination center designed to breed the next generation of the Circle. The revelation that they were planning to harvest my grandson's mind next sent a surge of adrenaline through me that was nearly impossible to hide. The SUV was a moving coffin, and the sound of the tires on the gravel was the first shovelful of dirt. We turned onto a narrow, unpaved logging road, the branches of the forest clawing at the windows like skeletal fingers. The SUV groaned as it climbed the final steep incline toward the ridge. My heart hammered against my ribs, a copper taste of adrenaline flooding my tongue. I knew we were reaching the end of the line. Through the rear window, I saw the first flickers of orange torchlight reflecting off the trees. The Circle was already gathered at the edge of the world. Thane stopped the vehicle at the cliff's edge overlooking Jagged Gorge. The sudden ringing silence after the engine died was more terrifying than the noise had been. I felt the cold, biting wind whistling through a cracked window, carrying the faint, metallic scent of ozone and pine needles. "Dad, please, I'm so sorry," Thane whispered one last time, his forehead resting against the steering wheel. "Move him," Arya commanded. "The time is now." I felt the door open, the humid mountain air rushing in to replace the smell of stale sweat and leather. I focused every ounce of my 72-year-old will into remaining limp, into being the vessel they expected. But beneath the surface, the hunter was fully awake. I was no longer just a father or a victim. I was an investigator who had finally gathered all the evidence he needed for a conviction. The only question now was whether I would live long enough to deliver the verdict. Thane and Arya grabbed my arms, dragging me out of the SUV. My heels dug into the dirt, the loose shale sliding beneath me as they hauled me toward the center of the clearing. I saw the robed figures, then 9 shadows standing in a semicircle around a massive flat stone slab. The torchlight made their distorted shadows dance against the trees, creating a theater of ancient predatory geometry. Thane turned the engine off, and in the sudden ringing silence, I heard the first low, guttural note of the chant rising from the darkness outside, a sound that meant the time for acting was officially over. The vibration of the chant felt like it was coming from the earth itself, a dissonant, low-frequency hum that signaled the start of the 0 hour. I closed my eyes for one final heartbeat, preparing my body for the explosive counterstrike I had been rehearsing in the dark of my bedroom. The performance was finished. The 9th offering was on the altar, but the wolves were about to find out that the lamb had been sharpening its teeth. The frost-covered ground of Jagged Gorge bit into my heels as they dragged me toward the stone slab. My body a carefully maintained lie of paralysis, while my heart beat with the precision of a detonator. I allowed my head to loll back. My eyes slitted just enough to take in the nightmare unfolding in the clearing. The air was thick with the scent of pine needles, and the acrid smoke of 9 torches, their orange flames licking the dark mountain sky. 9 robed figures stood in a wide semicircle, their hoods pointed and faces lost in shadow, looking exactly like the sketches Owen had hidden beneath his mattress. Thane and Arya hauled me to the center, their breathing heavy in the thin air. With a final unceremonious grunt, they hoisted me onto the flat, freezing surface of the stone altar. I lay there, positioned crucifixion style, my back absorbing the ancient cold of the rock. Damien stepped forward, shedding his lawyer's persona for the gaunt, skeletal elegance of a high priest. Brothers and sisters, the vessel is primed. He announced, his voice a resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate through the very stone beneath me. $7 million to fund the sacred work. Through blood, we prosper. Through death, we live. The rhythmic chanting of the cultists began then, a low, guttural drone that felt like a hypnotic physical pressure against my chest. They believed I was a captive audience, a drugged sacrifice incapable of even blinking. What they didn't know was that the paralytic Arya believed she had administered was actually swapped for a harmless saline solution by Nurse Elena during my ER visit. I had been at 100% physical capacity for days, waiting for this exact convergence of monsters. I observed them through the haze of my performance, counting their numbers and mapping their exits. The knife, the moon, the end. Or so they thought. Damien reached into the folds of his robe and produced an etched silver ceremonial blade, the metal gleaming with a predatory light under the full moon. He held it aloft, the silver reflecting the orange torchlight and the pale lunar glow. Thane was forced to his knees at the edge of the altar, his face a mask of catatonic shock. His eyes vacant and wet with tears he didn't have the strength to wipe away. "Watch Bloodline," Damien hissed, leaning over me. "This is the price of your survival." "Forgive me, Dad." Thane whispered a broken, barely audible sound that vanished into the roar of the chant. Damien began the final incantation, his voice rising in volume and intensity. He started the slow, ceremonial descent of the blade, the silver tip inching toward the center of my chest. I didn't move. I waited, counting my heartbeats, calculating the trajectory with mathematical precision. How many times had I practiced this motion in the dark of my bedroom while they thought I was sleeping? I waited until the blade was exactly 6 inches from my skin. Then the trap snapped shut. My hand exploded upward, my iron grip clamping onto Damien's wrist with a strength that shocked even me. The chanting stopped, instantly replaced by a collective gasp of pure, unadulterated horror. I didn't give him a second to recover. I rolled off the altar, using Damien's own momentum to slam him face down onto the stone slab where I had just been lying. The silver blade clattered to the ground, a useless toy. Simultaneously, the forest exploded. Blinding white light erupted from the tree line as Garrison's police team breached the clearing. The spotlights were a divine intrusion, stripping the shadows from the clearing and exposing the monsters for the cowards they were. Sirens wailed the sound, a beautiful, chaotic symphony that signaled the end of the 9th offering. Police hands in the air. "Nobody move!" The command echoed off the gorge walls as officers in tactical gear swarmed the site. I held Damien pinned to the altar, my knee in the small of his back, my hand twisting his arm until I heard the satisfying pop of a shoulder joint. "I'm not dying tonight, Damien," I snarled into his ear. "But you're definitely going away." The clearing was a sea of blue and red strobes, the robed figures scattering like roaches, only to be tackled by Garrison's men. I looked up and saw Garrison himself, his rifle raised, his face a mask of professional fury as he moved toward us. I felt the adrenaline beginning to ebb, replaced by a cold, crystalline satisfaction. The circle was broken. Thane remained on his knees, staring at me as if I were a ghost returned from the grave. Arya was nowhere to be seen in the immediate chaos, her absence a sharp, stinging needle of intuition in the back of my mind. As the cuffs clicked onto Damien's wrists, the metal biting into his skin, he let out a low, viscous laugh that made my blood run cold. "You think this is over, Kendrick?" He wheezed, his face pressed against the cold stone. "Look at the tree line. You're too late. She's already gone with the insurance." I turned my head just in time to see a flash of white through the skeletal trees, Arya's briefcase disappearing into the darkness toward the cliff's edge. A scream tore through the night, a high-pitched sound of final betrayal that didn't come from a cultist, but from the forest itself. I ignored Garrison's orders to stay down my legs, finding a strength they shouldn't have had as I tore after her. I turned my head as the cuffs clicked onto Damien's wrists just in time to see Arya's white briefcase disappear into the tree line, followed by a scream that sounded like a final betrayal. I ignored the scream of my 72-year-old joints and the shouting of the officers behind me, my eyes locked on the white flash of Arya's briefcase through the skeletal trees. Adrenaline is a deceptive fuel. It masked the structural failure of my knees as I tore through the undergrowth branches, clawing at my face like the hands of the very ghosts I was trying to avenge. I could hear her ahead of me, the heavy thud of her designer heels, unsuited for the mountain shale, and the frantic, shallow breaths of a predator who realized she had become the prey. I burst through a final screen of laurel and found her at the jagged edge of the gorge. The wind here was cold and biting, howling up from the 200-foot drop like a physical weight. Arya turned, the moonlight catching the sheer terror behind her eyes before she attempted to pull her mask of innocence back into place. "Warren, please," she wheezed, clutching the briefcase to her chest as if it were a shield. "You don't understand. They forced me. I was a vessel too." I didn't stop. I kept my pace steady, closing the distance with the mathematical certainty of a closing trap. I knew the truth now, and the truth had a name: Rebecca Bishop. A staircase. A shove. 5 years of silence sold for an insurance check. "You didn't just kill her, Arya," I said, my voice cutting through the wind with a clarity that surprised me. "You turned my son into a parasite. You used his fear to hollow out his soul." Arya's mask finally shattered, replaced by a low, viscous laugh that was stripped of all humanity. Rebecca was weak, Warren. She spat, her eyes flashing with a predatory light. "She found my phone, she saw the transfers, so I found the stairs. It was so easy. And Thane, he was even easier. He loved the money more than he loved her memory." I felt a cold, crystalline fury settle in my chest, a final clarity that wiped away the last of my paternal illusions. She had been the architect, but he had provided the foundation of silence. I stopped 10 feet from her, the loose sliding shale underfoot, warning me of the crumbling perimeter. Arya held up the white briefcase, her knuckles white. "I have it all, Warren. $7 million. Think of Owen. We can leave. I can give you the accounts. We can tell them it was all Damien. Just let me walk away, and the boy is set for life." I looked at the briefcase and then back at her. "Open it, Arya," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "See what a lifetime of murder is actually worth." She frowned, her fingers fumbling with the metallic snap of the latches. The sound was sharp, a final click in the darkness. She flung the lid open, expecting the green and white promise of a new life, but the mountain wind immediately caught the contents. Hundreds of sheets of blank printer paper swirled into the air, dancing like white moths against the black void of the gorge. "You useless old man," she screamed, her voice a jagged glass shard. "Where is it? Where is the money?" I watched the paper fall into the abyss, a silent snowfall of worthlessness. How is a soul weighed against a briefcase full of blank paper? I realized then that the bank transfer I'd executed weeks ago was the only thing that had truly mattered. The real funds were moved to an irrevocable trust for Owen before you even touched the coffee grounds, Arya. And as for Thane's debts, I used your forged power of attorney to pay off the cult's front companies directly. I bankrupted your local operation with your own stolen authority. You've been killing me for a hollow box. The humiliation seemed to hit her harder than the threat of prison. In a fit of animalistic rage, Arya lunged at me, her fingers curled into claws. I stepped aside, my investigator's instincts guiding my movement, but the crumbling edge of the gorge gave way beneath her. She overbalanced, a strangled cry escaping her as she slid toward the drop. I moved without thinking, my hand shooting out to catch her wrist. I felt the frantic, clawing grip of her fingernails on my skin as she dangled over the 200-foot drop. Her life was literally in my hands, a heavy, desperate weight pulling at my shoulder. For a heartbeat, I looked into her terrified eyes and saw the abyss. I realized that letting go would be so easy. It would be the final logical conclusion to this equation of death. But letting go would make me part of her world. It would mean the circle had finally won by turning me into a reflection of themselves. Her screams were the only thing filling the void of the gorge, a hollow sound for a hollow woman. I groaned as I hauled her upward, my last ounce of strength fueled by a moral restoration I hadn't felt in years. I dragged her back onto the solid earth, away from the sliding shale, just as the first blue and red strobes of Garrison's team began to cut through the trees. "I'm not like you," I whispered, my breath ragged. "I don't decide who lives and who dies." Garrison Price burst into the clearing, his weapon drawn, but he lowered it when he saw us. He moved quickly, the metallic sharp click of the handcuffs echoing the finality of the night. "Cuff her, Garrison," I said, stepping back and letting the adrenaline finally begin its slow, painful retreat. Let the cage be her altar now. As Arya was led away, her head bowed and her silk robe torn, I noticed something glinting at her throat. It was a locket that had belonged to my late wife, a silver piece I thought had been lost years ago. She had been wearing it as a trophy of her successful infiltration, a final insult I hadn't even noticed until the light of the police van hit it. I watched the taillights of the police van disappear, but the hardest part of the night was still standing 30 feet behind me, kneeling on the altar where he had almost watched me die. The adrenaline that had sustained my old bones began to ebb, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache as I looked at my son, not the architect or the accomplice, but the boy who had once traded his integrity for a handful of silver. I walked back toward the altar stones where Thane was still catatonic, his frame slumped against the cold, unyielding granite that was supposed to have been my tomb. The flashing, rhythmic blue lights of the police cruisers washed over the gray altar stones, turning the scene into a surreal, strobing nightmare of shadow and ice. I felt the cold, wet feeling of the grass through my thin trousers as I stopped a few feet away from him. He was trembling violently on the frost-covered ground, his breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches that puffed white in the metallic, sharp taste of the night air. Thane looked up at me, his eyes wide and leaking tears that left dark tracks through the dirt on his face. "I did it for Owen, Dad," he choked out, his voice a high-pitched, desperate whine. "I swear." She was going to take everything. She said if I didn't help, we'd be out on the street. I stood over him, not with the weakness of a victim he had helped to create, but with the heavy, terrible authority of a father who had finally seen the true face of his child. "You didn't do it for Owen Thane," I said, my voice sounding like the grinding of stones. "You did it because you were afraid to be poor. You traded your mother's memory and your father's life for a cleared ledger and a house you didn't earn. How do you look at the man you taught to walk and see the person who tried to help you into your grave?" The question hung between us, unanswered by his pathetic sobs. Thane tried to reach for my hand, but I stepped back, the rhythmic crunch of gravel under heavy police boots drawing closer as Garrison's men began to sweep the clearing for any remaining cultists. "Dad, please," Thane begged, his voice breaking. "She trapped me. She showed me things. I had to. I actually thought about backing out. 3 times, Dad." I almost stopped her. He looked at me with a flicker of hope, as if a near miss at morality was enough to grant him a reprieve. But then he confessed the final weight that kept him anchored to the circle. "Each time I tried to walk away, She showed me a gift, he whispered. A piece of jewelry she'd taken from Mom's vanity before the stairs. A locket, a ring. She reminded me that she already owned my past. If I went to the police, she'd make sure I went down for the accident too. The lake was blue. The blood was red. The memory was a lie. I remembered taking him to Lake Julian when he was 10, teaching him how to cast a line and telling him that a man was only as good as the truth he kept. I realized now that the boy on that boat had been a stranger to the man kneeling in the dirt. A man's character is tested when he has power, and when he's lost everything I told him, looking down at the wreckage of my legacy. You failed both tests, Thane. You let a monster into our home because you were too weak to stand on your own 2 feet. Please, he whimpered, the sound of the handcuffs clicking on the other cultists echoing through the trees. Don't let them take me. Don't let Owen know what I am. Tell him I was sick. Tell him I wasn't evil. I felt a profound sorrow that transcended my own anger. I realized that while I could find it in my heart to forgive the man, the broken, hollowed-out version of the son I loved, I could not shield the criminal from the consequences of his choices. To do so would be to continue the very cycle of lies that had nearly extinguished us both. Garrison Price approached us then, his heavy police boots slow and deliberate. He looked at me, a silent question in his eyes, waiting for the signal. I took a deep breath, the cold air stinging my lungs, and gave a single, slow nod. The law has no heart to forgive with Thane, I whispered. Garrison stepped forward and pulled Thane to his feet. The metallic, sharp click of the handcuffs wasn't just steel. They were the final period at the end of a long, dark sentence Thane had been writing for years. I forgive you, son, but I won't lie for you. I watched as Garrison led him away toward the police vans, Thane's legs buckling as he begged for mercy that no longer belonged to me. The silence of the forest was suddenly weighing more than the noise, a heavy, suffocating blanket that pressed down on the clearing as the last robed figure was hauled into the shadows. I stood alone in the center of the ritual site, the gray altar stones looking small and insignificant in the dawn's first light. I thought the night was over, that the ledger was finally closed. Then the silence was shattered by a sound that made my blood turn to ice. Garrison's radio clipped to his shoulder as he walked toward the command post, crackled with a frantic, distorted burst of static. A voice, high-pitched and terrified, cut through the mountain air. "Captain, come in. We've secured the perimeter at the estate, but we have a problem. The lieutenant, Xavier, he's still inside. He's barricaded in the nursery. The boy is in danger. I repeat, the boy is in danger." The world tilted on its axis. Garrison revealed that the circle had a third member inside the Kendrick household. The real estate agent, who had been handling the sale of the house, was also a high-ranking cultist, the one they called the lieutenant. I stood alone in the clearing as the last van door slammed shut, the silence of the forest suddenly weighing more than the noise. When Garrison's radio crackled with a frantic update from the house. "The lieutenant is still inside. The boy is in danger." Garrison's tires screamed against the asphalt of Orchard Heights Drive as we fishtailed into my driveway, the house sitting like a dark, jagged tooth against the pre-dawn sky. I didn't wait for the vehicle to reach a full stop before I was out the door, the physical exhaustion of the night replaced by a cold, sharpened clarity. The front door was ajar, a silent invitation into a house that had been my sanctuary and then my cage. I burst into the foyer, Garrison right behind me with his weapon drawn, but the sounds of struggle weren't coming from the master suite. They were coming from the kitchen. I rounded the corner and skidded to a halt on the tile. Lieutenant Xavier, a man whose nondescript face had faded into the background of my life as a neighbor for years, now stood exposed in my kitchen with a cold, frantic desperation in his eyes. He was the one who had played the role of the humble real estate agent. And now I saw the predator beneath the suit. He had Owen pulled against his chest, one hand gripped tightly around the boy's waist, while the other held a heavy kitchen knife flat against the table. "Get away from my grandson, Xavier," I snarled, my voice steady despite the roar of blood in my ears. The game is over. Damien is in cuffs. Arya is gone. There is nowhere left for you to go. Xavier's eyes darted between me and Garrison, the sweat beads on his forehead, catching the overhead light. One move, Kendrick, and the bloodline ends here, he wheezed. I saw the tremor in his hand. He was a cornered animal far more dangerous than the cold professionals I'd outsmarted at the gorge. I looked at Owen, whose small face was pale but determined. I knew you'd come, Grandpa. He cried, his voice small but certain. I told him you were the king. I needed a distraction, a single window of opportunity where the mathematical certainty of the strike outweighed the risk. I began to stagger, letting my knees buckle as I fell into the persona of the frail, poisoned old man one last time. My shoulder hit the doorframe, and I let out a wheezing, pathetic gasp. One move, one breath. The boy lived, or the boy died. As Xavier instinctively looked down at my collapsing form, Garrison fired a non-lethal round that caught the refrigerator, the loud clang shattering Xavier's focus. In that heartbeat, I lunged with a strength that defied my 72 years, my fingers locking around Xavier's wrist and twisting it away from the table. Garrison was on him in seconds, a blur of blue and black tactical gear that slammed the cultist into the cabinets. Owen tore himself free and leaped into my arms, his sticky, frantic grip around my neck, the only thing keeping me upright. I held him so tight, I could feel his heartbeat slowing to match mine, a protective triumph that washed away the last of the night's terror. 1 week later, the house felt like a hollow shell. I stood in the foyer with a real estate agent, a legitimate one this time, watching as the for sale sign was hammered into the front lawn with a heavy metallic thud. The house, once a family legacy, was now just a collection of poisoned memories and hollow hallways that I needed to excise from my life forever. Sell it as is, I told the agent, my voice devoid of sentiment. I don't want a single stick of furniture coming with us. I want it stripped to the floorboards. The woman looked at me with a mix of pity and professional greed. It's a beautiful property, Mr. Kendrick, she said, her eyes scanning the mountain view. Most people would kill for this view. How do you put a price on a house where the walls themselves tried to swallow you whole? I didn't answer. I had already spoken with Garrison earlier that morning. I revealed to him that I wasn't just selling the house to escape. I had arranged for the entire equity of the sale to be donated to a national foundation for victims of elder abuse. I wanted to ensure the Circle's target assets were used to destroy the very methodology they had perfected. By the time I reached the living room, the movers had already cleared the space. Only the fireplace remained a stone mouth that had witnessed so many lies. I sat on a lone crate, staring at a manila envelope that had arrived that morning from the county jail. It was Thane's first attempt at contact since the arrest. I saw his familiar, slanted handwriting on the envelope, the same hand that had helped carry the stone altar into my basement. I didn't open it. I knew what it contained: excuses, pleas for a leniency he hadn't earned, and the hollow apologies of a man who only felt regret because he'd been caught. Forgiveness is a quiet thing, Thane, I whispered to the empty room. It doesn't need an audience, and it doesn't need to change the locks. The fireplace was an altar of a different kind. A place of purification where the lies finally stopped breathing. I tossed the unopened envelope into the orange glow of the cedar wood fire. The paper curled and turned to ash, taking the last of my son's excuses with it. As the flames consumed the heavy stock, a small Polaroid fell out of the burning flap and landed on the hearth. It was a photo of Warren and Thane fishing years ago at Lake Julian, both of us smiling into the sun. I stared at the image, realizing that even in his final plea, Thane was trying to use my own most precious memories as a manipulative tool. He thought a frozen moment of the past could rewrite the betrayal of the present. I reached out with the poker and pushed the photo into the white-hot center of the logs. I watched the photo of the blue lake turn to gray soot, then turned my back on the empty house. knowing that the only thing left to build was a future where the salt air would finally wash away the taste of copper. The rhythmic crash of the Atlantic waves was the first sound in 3 months that didn't feel like a threat, a heavy, salt-laden lullaby that finally began to drown out the echoes of Orchard Heights. I sat on the porch of our new cottage in Wilmington, the wood of the rocking chair creaking a steady, solid rhythm beneath me. The air here was different, cleaner, sharper, devoid of the cloyingly sweet chemical lavender that had nearly become my shroud. Beside me, Owen was busy with a bucket and spade, his small feet buried in the cold sand that had drifted up toward the porch steps. I watched him closely, my investigator's eyes now searching for joy rather than deception. His drawings had changed. The black crayon and the hooded figures were gone, replaced by vibrant blues and yellows. He was currently sketching a pod of dolphins he'd seen earlier that morning, his tongue poked out in concentration. "Grandpa, can the star people swim this far?" he asked without looking up, his voice light and curious rather than haunted. I took a sip of my fresh mint tea, the steam warming my face. "No, Owen," I said, my voice firmer than it had been in years. "The salt water washes all the bad stars away. They can't follow us here." He nodded, satisfied with the logic of a 7-year-old, and went back to his masterpiece. I felt a surge of protective peace. This was the sanctuary I had promised him. A few days prior, I had sat in a sterile law office in downtown Wilmington to finalize the last of the Kendrick legacy. I met with a new attorney, a woman who didn't know the name Damien and didn't care for occult leverage. I signed the documents that secured Owen's trust, but I went a step further. I officially named Garrison Price as his legal guardian, should my 72-year-old heart finally decide it has had enough. It was a choice born of the fires we had both walked through, a solidifying of a chosen family bond that was stronger than the bloodline that had betrayed me. Is it possible for the same heart to be completely broken and utterly full at the exact same time? I looked at Owen and knew the answer was yes. I had lost a son to greed, but I had saved a grandson for the future. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon on September 27th, a familiar black SUV pulled into the sandy driveway. Garrison stepped out, looking weary but satisfied, his shoulders less slumped than they had been at the gorge. He joined me on the porch, the smell of salt air and fresh tea a far cry from the gun oil and pine of our last meeting. "It's over, Warren," he said, leaning against the railing. The federal trials moved fast. Aria and Damien received life sentences without parole. No appeals, no loopholes. They're going to spend the rest of their days in a different kind of circle, one made of concrete and iron. Life without parole. A different kind of coffin. I let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding since June, and Thane Garrison's expression softened. His trial is still pending, but the plea deal is on the table. 20 years. He's cooperating now, giving up the names of the regional handlers. He's trying to earn back a soul he already sold, but at least he's talking. We sat in silence for a long time, watching the tide come in. "I told you I wouldn't let you die alone," Warren Garrison whispered. I looked at my old partner and smiled. "I didn't die at all, Garrison. I just finally woke up." The 15-year estrangement between us had been mended by the very nightmare intended to destroy me. On the last morning of September, I woke before the sun. I walked to Owen's room and found him already awake, staring out the window at the navy blue sky. I wrapped him in a blanket and led him out to the rocking chair. We sat together as the horizon began to bleed gold and violet. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled piece of paper, the very first drawing Owen had ever made of the boat we now saw bobbing in the distance. I had kept it hidden, a tiny spark of truth I refused to let the circle extinguish. "Look at this, Owen," I said, handing it to him. "You knew we'd be here long before I did." He beamed, clutching the paper. "I'm glad you're the king of the hill, Grandpa." I held him tighter, realizing that my vigilance was no longer a burden, but a legacy. The sunrise wasn't just a new day. It was the final signature on a contract for a life I had finally earned back. I looked at the boy and saw a reflection that was no longer hollow. "Owen," I said, my voice low and serious, "listen to me. When something feels wrong in your heart, you listen to it. Even if the whole world says you're crazy, even if the people you love tell you it's just the fog, you trust yourself. That's how you stay free." He looked up at me, his eyes bright with the rising sun. "I will, Grandpa. I promise." The poison had been a catalyst, stripping away my complacency and making me a sharper investigator at 72 than I ever was at 40. It had cost me a home and a son, but it had given me a purpose that would outlast my own bones. As the sun cleared the horizon, I realized that the greatest victory wasn't catching the cult. It was looking into my grandson's eyes and seeing a reflection that was no longer hollow. The Atlantic roared a steady, permanent sound that reminded me that the world was vast and the circle was small. We were safe. We were awake. And for the first time in my life, the math finally added up to peace. I've replayed everything in my mind more times than I can count. What happened to me wasn't just a crime. It was a warning hidden inside a painful family story. I trusted comfort more than instinct, and I ignored the quiet alarms in my heart because I wanted peace inside my home. If you take anything from this family story, let it be this: love should never require you to ignore the truth. I once believed that protecting family meant trusting them without question. I was wrong. Real protection sometimes means asking hard questions before it's too late. My survival turned into something people now call a dad revenge story, but revenge was never my goal. Justice was, and if my dad revenge became a lesson for someone else, then maybe the suffering wasn't meaningless. When betrayal comes from your own blood, the pain cuts deeper than any knife. Yet even in the darkest moment of this family story, I believe God was watching, guiding me just enough to keep my grandson safe. Faith doesn't erase the danger, but it gives you the strength to stand when everything else collapses. So if you're listening to this family story, remember, trust your instincts, protect the people who truly deserve it, and never surrender your judgment for the illusion of family harmony. My journey became a dad revenge that exposed the truth, but the real victory was saving the next generation from the same darkness. And if there is one final truth from this dad revenge, it's that courage sometimes begins with simply refusing to stay silent. Thank you for staying with me until the end of this journey. I'd really like to hear your thoughts. What would you do if you found yourself in Warren's position, facing betrayal from your own family? Share your perspective in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, consider subscribing so you won't miss future stories like this one. Please remember that while this narrative draws inspiration from real human conflicts and social themes, certain elements were dramatized for storytelling purposes. And if this type of story isn't what you're looking for today, feel free to explore other videos on the channel that might suit you better. Coincidental.